Hello, my name is Kent Field, and thank you for tuning into this YouTube channel, The Bible versus Opinions. God bless you in your search for the truth. While all people have opinions on many subjects, including the Bible and religion, not all opinions carry the same weight or value. For example, would you go to a plumber for his advice on brain surgery? Would you go to a mechanic for his advice on heart surgery? The point is, not all opinions carry the same weight or value on a particular subject. That's why I'm not offering you my mere opinion, but Bible answers alone. So here's the challenge. Are you open to learning beyond your current understanding and knowledge of the Bible? If so, then this channel is for you. If these studies have helped you to grow in your understanding of the Bible, or even life itself, please like and subscribe and share this channel with others so that they too may be challenged and grow in their understanding of the scriptures.
So what if the exact same historical standards that we use to prove Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon, or that Socrates drank hemlock, were applied to the New Testament?
Oh, it's a huge question.
Right, like if we stripped away the stained glass, the theology, and all those centuries of religious tradition and just, treated these texts like a historical crime scene, what does the actual evidence look like?
I mean, it really forces a complete mental shift. Because most people, they naturally compartmentalize ancient texts.
Yeah, totally.
Classical history goes into one bucket, like the solid, dependable bucket we teach in universities.
Yeah.
And then religious texts go into an entirely different bucket labeled faith or myth or philosophy.
Exactly. But historians don't actually get to use different investigative tools just because a document happens to contain claims about the supernatural.
No, they don't. The rules of textual criticism are the same across the board.
And that is our mission for this deep dive today. We are essentially smashing those two buckets together.
I love that.
We're taking a strictly historical and documentary approach to the New Testament. And we're operating off this really fascinating set of materials today, specifically a lecture transcript and some study guides compiled by Dr. Kent A. Field.
Which are incredibly detailed, by the way.
They really are.
Yeah.
But I want to set a very clear baseline for you, the listener, before we take another step. Our goal today is not to debate theology.
Right.
We are not here to endorse a specific religious viewpoint or convince you of anything spiritual.
Yeah, we are simply putting the text under the exact same forensic microscope that historians use for any other classical document from antiquity.
Exactly, just looking at the data.
We're going to impartially report on how these materials analyze the historical reliability of the New Testament. Looking through ancient manuscript comparisons, secular critiques, and historical forensics.
Let's start with how the text actually presents itself. Like if you pick up a book and the first line is, once upon a time in a faraway land, your brain instantly categorizes it.
Right, you're dealing with a fairy tale.
Yeah, or a myth. The author is signaling to you that historical accuracy isn't the point at all.
And that internal presentation of a document is, it's the very first thing a textual critic looks at. And the New Testament simply does not read like ancient mythology.
It doesn't have that vibe.
Not at all. Yeah. If you look at Homer's Odyssey or Hesiod's Theogony, the structure is very ethereal. It's poetic. It exists in this nebulous, age of heroes.
Right.
But take the Gospel of Luke, the author who was actually a physician. He explicitly states his methodology right there in the prologue.
He literally spells it out.
Yeah. He writes that he's compiling an account based on eyewitness testimony, investigating everything carefully from the beginning to write it out in consecutive order.
Which, that sounds incredibly clinical to me. It sounds like an investigative journalist laying out their methodology before dropping a massive expose.
It is a fundamentally different genre of writing than myth. And Luke actually goes further by dating his writing using incredibly specific, verifiable political markers.
Right, he drops names.
Oh, heavily. In the third chapter, he doesn't use vague phrasing like, in the days of old. He explicitly dates the events to the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea.
Wow.
He even notes that Herod was tetrarch of Galilee.
Okay, wait. I want to pause on tetrarch for a second, because that's one of those words you read and just kind of skip over. A tetrarch was essentially like a regional governor appointed by Rome, right?
Yeah, exactly. A local ruler managing a specific geographic quadrant. And Luke doesn't even stop there.
There's more.
Yeah. He names other local officials like Philip and Lysanias and the high priests Annas and Caiaphas. This is the sane, sober presentation of history. He's giving his readers the exact time, the exact province, and the specific bureaucrats who are in charge.
He's dropping these highly specific pins on a political map, which really sets up something Dr. Field's materials call the acid test of history.
Oh, the acid test is fascinating.
It absolutely blew my mind. It's this idea of writing to a living audience about events they supposedly witnessed themselves.
Yeah, it's the ultimate crucible for an ancient historian. Like, if we look at the Apostle Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, specifically chapter 15, he makes this staggering claim.
Okay.
He writes that after Jesus was crucified, he appeared alive to more than 500 people at a single time.
That's a huge crowd.
It is. But the real linchpin of that claim is Paul's explicit statement that the majority of those 500 people were still alive right then.
Wait, really?
Yes, at the exact moment he was writing the letter.
Okay, imagine publishing a controversial investigative article about a major event in your hometown. Like, you claim that 500 people saw the mayor take a bribe in the town square.
Right.
And you publish this while all the witnesses, the local police, and the mayor are still alive and walking around. You would be instantly debunked.
Instantly.
You can't just publish a claim that massive if it didn't happen, because your readers would literally just go knock on their neighbors' doors and ask them.
Exactly. And the historical records in the book of Acts note that just weeks after these events allegedly happened, thousands of locals in Jerusalem believed the accounts.
Weeks later.
Yeah. The very people who had been in the city during the Passover when the crucifixion took place. Acts 2 records 3,000 people adopting this belief in a single day.
Well, that's a massive problem if you're trying to argue this was just some fabricated myth. I mean, thousands of locals don't just instantly upend their lives and adopt a radical new belief if the core claims could be easily disproved.
Right.
Like, they could just take a 10-minute walk down the street to check the tomb or interrogate the supposed witnesses. So they passed the acid test.
They did. But, making bold historical claims to a first-century audience is really just the first hurdle. Historians face an even bigger problem when looking back to millennia.
Right, because surviving the first century is one thing. Surviving the next 20 centuries is a completely different ballgame. Like, how do we know the version of the New Testament sitting on a desk today hasn't been playing a 2,000-year game of telephone? Maybe the original authors were truthful, but some monks in the Middle Ages just completely altered the text.
And this is where textual criticism becomes intensely mathematical. We have to look at manuscript attestation.
The numbers game.
The numbers game, exactly.
Yeah.
The materials we're reviewing provide this really fascinating side-by-side comparison chart of classical histories. So let's look at a foundational text of Western civilization, Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars.
Which is a text that, no historian on earth doubts. We teach it in military academies and history departments globally as absolute fact.
100%. Yet we only have 9 or 10 manuscript copies of that text in existence.
Wait, single digits?
Yes, 9 or 10. And furthermore, the earliest physical copy we possess dates to 950 AD.
Hold on. Caesar fought those wars and wrote about them around 50 BC. And our earliest physical copy is from 950 AD. That is a 1,000-year blind spot. A full millennium where we have zero documentary evidence, and yet we just sort of trust that the monks copying it got it right.
That's the reality of ancient history. A 1,000-year gap is actually quite standard for classical antiquity.
That's wild.
Consider the Greek historians, like Thucydides and Herodotus. We possess only 8 manuscript copies of their works, with a staggering 1,300 to 1,400-year gap between the original authorship and our earliest surviving copies.
Wow. What about the Roman historian Tacitus? His annals are basically the bedrock of our understanding of the early Roman Empire.
We have only 2 surviving manuscripts of Tacitus.
2?
Just 2. One has an 850-year gap, the other a 1,000-year gap. And secular historians teach these texts as verified, unquestionable history every single day. The documentary foundation of classical history is actually remarkably thin.
Okay, so stack those numbers up against the New Testament. If 10 copies and a 1,000-year gap is the gold standard for Julius Caesar, what does the New Testament look like?
The contrast is difficult to overstate. For the New Testament, we possess between 4,000 and 20,000 manuscript copies and fragments, depending on, how you categorize the later translations.
That's thousands.
Thousands. Many of the most crucial ones are written in ancient Greek uncials, which is basically an ancient script written entirely in capital letters. It's a hallmark of the very earliest manuscripts.
And what about the time gap?
The earliest complete or near-complete copies we have date back to the 3rd and 4th centuries, and fragments go back even further.
Okay.
That means the gap between the original writings and the copies we hold today is only about 250 to 350 years. Compared to a 1,000-year gap for Caesar, it's just a blink of an eye.
Okay, let's play devil's advocate here for a second.
Sure.
Even with thousands of copies, couldn't a small, powerful group of early church leaders have just gathered all these texts together, edited them to match whatever theology they wanted, and then destroyed the originals?
Logistically, prior to the invention of the printing press, that kind of coordinated tampering is virtually impossible.
Why is that?
Because these thousands of manuscripts were handwritten on papyrus and parchment. They weren't kept in one central library. They were scattered across vastly different geographical regions, from Egypt to Rome to Asia Minor.
Oh, I see.
Plus, they were being translated into different languages simultaneously, like Syriac, Coptic, and Latin.
So you're saying a conspiracy would require a group of people in the 2nd or 3rd century to somehow travel across the entire known world?
Without modern transportation.
Right. Track down thousands of independent, localized groups holding these manuscripts, confiscate their scrolls, rewrite them all to agree perfectly, and then redistribute them without leaving a single historical record of this massive global confiscation effort.
It completely defies all historical and logistical reality. I mean, the sheer volume of manuscripts, combined with their wide geographic distribution and remarkable agreement in form and substance, is precisely what cements their textual reliability. You simply cannot coordinate a retroactive conspiracy across continents in the ancient world.
So the documents we have today accurately reflect what was written in the 1st century. But a well-preserved document isn't the whole puzzle.
Right.
Like, I could write a deeply clinical, well-preserved diary claiming I invented the internet. Does anyone outside this specific movement corroborate the historical events?
They do, actually. And this introduces one of the most powerful concepts in historical forensics, the hostile or indifferent witness.
Okay.
Let's start with the ancient pagan writers. These were Roman bureaucrats and commentators who had absolutely no vested interest in promoting a new religion.
They were just doing their jobs or writing their own histories.
Precisely. A writer named Thallus, operating around 52 AD, writes about the crucifixion of Jesus. Interestingly, he tries to explain away the strange darkness that fell over the land during the execution as a solar eclipse.
Oh, so he doesn't deny the event happened at all.
No, he just tries to give it a naturalistic explanation. Then you have Cornelius Tacitus, writing around 115 AD, who explicitly confirms the crucifixion of Christ under the hands of Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius.
Which perfectly aligns with the exact political pins Luke dropped on his map earlier.
It aligns flawlessly. And perhaps the most fascinating is Pliny the Younger. He was a Roman governor in modern-day Turkey. Around 112 AD, he wrote a letter to the Emperor Trajan.
What was the letter about?
It's essentially an administrative memo. He's asking for legal advice on how many of these early Christians he should be executing.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And in his letter, he documents their absolute devotion, their habit of singing hymns to Christ as to a god, and their willingness to die rather than curse his name.
He's documenting the sociological fallout of the empty tomb from the perspective of an annoyed Roman bureaucrat.
Exactly.
And what about the ancient Jewish writings? Because the early Christian movement and the established first-century Jewish leadership were locked in this massive ideological conflict.
Oh, the conflict was severe. Yet, if we look at the Talmud, specifically the Mishnah and the Gemara, which compiled Jewish religious laws and commentaries, they mention a figure named Yeshua of Nazareth over 80 times.
I would imagine those mentions are not exactly flattering.
They are highly derogatory. They accuse him of practicing sorcery and leading Israel astray. But the derogatory nature is actually what makes them so historically valuable.
How so?
They never once claim he was a myth. They acknowledge his existence, his miracles, which they reframe as sorcery, of course, and his execution.
That makes sense. They couldn't deny he existed because it was public knowledge, so they just attacked his character instead.
Exactly. And then there is Flavius Josephus. He was a first-century Jewish general who essentially defected to the Romans and became a historian.
Viewed by many of his contemporaries as a massive traitor, right?
A deeply controversial figure, for sure, but an invaluable historian. Josephus writes extensively about the political climate of the New Testament. He details the Herods, Pilate, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and John the Baptist.
Okay.
And in a highly scrutinized passage, he explicitly mentions Jesus. He calls him a wise man, confirms his crucifixion by Pilate at the suggestion of Jewish leaders, and crucially reports that the followers of Jesus claimed he appeared to them alive on the 3rd day.
It's amazing. Why does hostile testimony like this carry so much weight when we're trying to reconstruct history?
Well, it comes down to motive. In any court of law or in textual analysis, if a friendly witness confirms your story, it's helpful, but it's always subject to bias.
Yeah.
But if your sworn enemy, the person who desperately wants to discredit your movement, is forced to admit that your foundational facts are true, that is ironclad evidence. The Roman and Jewish leadership had every incentive to say Jesus of Nazareth never existed. The fact that they didn't tells historians that his existence was an undeniable public reality.
So you have the internal clinical presentation, unparalleled manuscript numbers, and external corroboration from sworn enemies. How do modern secular historians process this massive stack of data? It seems like it would put them in an incredibly uncomfortable position.
It creates a really deep cognitive dissonance, and the materials highlight several prominent examples of this. Take H.G. Wells, for instance.
Like the sci-fi author.
Yeah, most people know him for his science fiction, like The War of the Worlds, but he was also a prolific historian. He wrote this massive comprehensive work called The Outline of History.
Okay.
Now, Wells was an outspoken atheist, yet he devotes over 500 pages of his historical outline to Jesus of Nazareth.
500 pages from an atheist historian. Where is he even getting his source material if he rejects the religion?
That is the ultimate contradiction. Wells relies entirely on the New Testament as his sole historical source material. He uses it to outline what Jesus said, where he traveled, and the political impact of his life.
I sense a but coming.
But because Wells holds a philosophical bias against anything supernatural, he selectively strips out the miraculous elements and literally invents his own non-historical explanations to fill the gaps.
Without any ancient documents backing him up.
Without a single ancient document to back him up.
Wait, I remember reading about his theory regarding the account of Jesus walking on water. It is almost comical.
Oh, it really highlights the lengths a historian will go to avoid the miraculous. Wells accepted the New Testament geography and the fact that a major event occurred on the Sea of Galilee.
Right.
But to avoid the miracle, he theorized that a wooden fishing shack blew down in a storm, and Jesus essentially surfed out to the disciples' boat on a wooden door.
Surfing on a door in the middle of a squall. I mean, he literally invented a first-century extreme sport out of thin air just so he didn't have to accept his primary source document.
Yeah. And Will Durant does something incredibly similar. Durant authored the monumental series, The Story of Civilization.
Okay.
In his volume, Caesar and Christ, he explicitly states that the New Testament documents are our only reliable source material for writing about the man of history. He accepts all the manuscript evidence.
What?
But when confronted with the resurrection, Durant promotes what is known as the swoon theory.
I've heard of the... This is the idea that he didn't actually die on the cross, right?
Yes. Durant suggests Jesus merely passed out or swooned from exhaustion and pain. Then, placed in the cool, damp environment of the tomb, he naturally revived, untied himself from his grave clothes, pushed away a stone weighing thousands of pounds, slipped past trained Roman guards, and walked miles on pierced feet to convince his disciples he had conquered death.
I mean, believing that requires almost as much faith as believing in a resurrection. It's just astonishing that a respected historian would put that to paper.
It's a desperate attempt to reconcile unquestionable historical documents with a modern, materialistic worldview. So William Ramsey experienced this exact tension too.
Who is he?
He was an esteemed archaeologist and an atheist at the University of Aberdeen. He traveled to the Middle East with a spade and shovel, fully intending to prove the New Testament was a geographical and historical fraud.
He went looking for the evidence to bury it once and for all.
Exactly. And the opposite happened. As he excavated, he found that the political titles, the city borders, and the cultural nuances recorded in the text, specifically by Luke, were so staggeringly precise that he was eventually convinced of their total reliability.
Oh.
The historical evidence literally forced him to change his entire worldview.
It's wild. They trust the text completely when it comes to geography and politics, but they invent door surfing theories when the physics get uncomfortable.
Right.
Well, let's put Durant's swoon theory to the ultimate test. If we're treating this like a historical crime scene, what do the medical forensics actually say about the crucifixion and the burial?
When you apply medical forensics, the swoon theory just evaporates. The Romans were engineers of death. Crucifixion wasn't just tying a dissident to a tree.
Right.
It was a highly calculated, excruciating execution method designed to produce maximum physiological shock. Before the cross, the victim endured a Roman scourging. The whip had pieces of bone and metal braided into the leather, designed to tear flesh away, often exposing the skeletal muscle and ribcage.
So the physiological trauma before the crucifixion even began would put someone in critical condition.
Absolutely. Severe blood loss, hypovolemic shock. And the historical record notes a highly specific detail about the death itself. To ensure the victims were dead before the Sabbath, a Roman centurion took a spear, a heavy weapon with 3 feet of steel, and thrust it up into his side.
Okay.
The text records that a sudden flow of blood and water came out.
Now, I've heard medical professionals talk about this specific detail. Why is the blood and water so clinically important?
It is the absolute smoking gun of clinical death. The spear thrust upward under the ribs would pierce the lungs and the heart. The water, the author observed, was pleural and pericardial fluid.
Really?
Yeah. Under extreme stress and trauma, the sac surrounding the heart, the pericardium, fills with a watery fluid. When pierced, that fluid separates from the heavier red blood cells.
So he was just describing what he saw.
Exactly. A first-century fisherman wouldn't know the pathology of pericardial effusion. He just wrote down exactly what he witnessed. But modern medicine tells us that detail is undeniable proof of a ruptured heart sac. He was categorically dead.
So he definitely didn't wake up in the tomb needing a glass of water. He is dead. But let's look at the burial itself. Couldn't someone have just snuck in and taken the body to start a movement?
The logistics of first-century Jewish burial customs make that an incredibly steep hill to climb. According to the texts, the body was wrapped in roughly 100 pounds of myrrh, aloes, and linen grave clothes. This wasn't a light dusting of spices.
100 pounds of myrrh, that's an industrial amount of spice.
It creates a sticky, heavy casing. When that mixture dries, it forms a rock-hard, epoxy-like mummy cocoon around the body.
Oh, wow.
The texts note that when the disciples entered the tomb, they saw the linen wrappings lying there intact, like an empty shell. To pull a battered body out of an epoxy cocoon without unraveling and destroying the linens is physically highly improbable.
And what about the physical security of the tomb itself? Because this wasn't just a shallow grave in the woods.
No, it was a tomb hewn directly out of solid bedrock. There's no digging your way in from the back. The only entrance was sealed with a massive stone, often rolled down an incline into a groove, weighing hundreds, sometimes thousands of pounds.
Right.
Furthermore, because the Jewish leaders were paranoid about the disciples stealing the body, they requested Roman security. Pilate posted a Roman guard unit, highly trained killers, and they placed the Emperor Caesar's official wax seal on the stone.
And breaking a Roman seal wasn't a minor offense. It was an automatic, gruesome death sentence.
Absolutely.
Yet, despite the catastrophic medical trauma, the epoxy cocoon, the solid rock walls, the massive stone, the armed guards, and the emperor's seal, on the 3rd day, the tomb was empty. Let's look at the motives of the only people who could have been involved. Who steals the body?
You really only have 2 groups, the enemies or the friends. The Jewish leaders and the Romans had zero motive to steal the body. Their entire goal was to keep him dead and crush the movement. If they had moved the body for safekeeping, the absolute second that disciples started preaching in the streets that he was alive, the Romans would have simply paraded the corpse through Jerusalem on a cart.
The movement would have died on a Tuesday.
It would have been extinguished immediately.
So the enemies definitely didn't take it. What about the friends?
Psychologically, it just doesn't align. The disciples were terrified. When he was arrested, they scattered. They were hiding behind locked doors, fearing they were next on the execution block.
Right.
You do not transition from cowering in fear to willingly enduring torture, imprisonment, and horrific deaths for a lie that you yourself concocted. People will die for what they believe is true, even if they're mistaken. But nobody willingly dies for a hoax they invented.
Especially not a group of fishermen trying to overpower a unit of armed Roman sentries. The motives just aren't there.
No, they really aren't.
We have covered an immense amount of historical ground here today, and I want to try and pull all these threads together for you, the listener. By removing the theology and treating the New Testament strictly as an ancient historical document, the data reveals a startling picture.
It really does. The documents pass the acid test of being published to a living, hostile audience. They boast a level of manuscript preservation, thousands of copies with only a few centuries gap, that makes Julius Caesar's historical record look incredibly flimsy by comparison.
Yeah, and it's corroborated by outside hostile witnesses who hated the movement but just couldn't deny the basic facts. And the historical grounding is so firm that modern secular historians are forced to rely on it, even when they invent theories like surfing on doors or waking up from a spear to the heart just to avoid the implications.
And as we conclude, I think it's important to reiterate our perspective today. Dr. Field's materials clearly synthesize these facts to make a passionate theological argument about faith. But our goal was simply to isolate and examine the documentary evidence they brought to the table. We're just analyzing the structural integrity of the history itself.
And that history leaves you with a truly provocative final thought. Imagine for a second that we decide the New Testament documents are completely unreliable. We throw them out. We say the manuscript gaps are too wide, the external witnesses aren't enough, and the internal dating is irrelevant. If we establish that as our baseline for historical truth, consistency demands that we take an eraser to almost everything we know about classical antiquity.
That's very true.
If the New Testament goes, Julius Caesar goes, Plato goes, Aristotle goes, it really forces you to ask the question, how much of what we consider to be absolute, unquestionable, settled history rests on a foundation far weaker than the one we just explored?
Thanks for being a part of that study segment. I promise you that, Lord willing, there's more to come. With the understanding that the mind can only absorb what the seat can endure, many of these studies have been broken up into a series of bite-sized segments. So be sure to look for the next segment in each Bible study subject, so you won't miss out on any important information. Please like and subscribe if you feel that this lesson's helped you, and God bless you in your search for truth.